All right. Apparently this meeting is being recorded. That's a new feature in Zoom. It tells you that, which is okay with me. All right. So anybody remember what we did last week?
Talked about the Baptist.
Talk about Baptist. Took a long time to get here, didn't it?
A year.
So what do you remember about us talking about Baptist last week? Does anybody remember the three sort of broad schools of thought on where Baptists come from?
The Puritans.
They're an offshoot of the Puritans / separatists, the factions that were looking to continue the Reformation in England and to break away from it. So yes, one of the three is would include the Puritans or English separatists or other things that are there.
One of them is that they've always been,
Right.
they've never been part of the Catholic Church. They aren't part of the Reformation.
That feature is sometimes referred to as a secessionist, meaning that it's a secession that goes all the way back to the book of Acts. Another term that's used to describe that is landmarkism, a landmark Baptist, that they go all the way back. And that's the concept is Baptists are just an expression of what is an unbroken line that goes all the way back doctrinally and in other ways back to the first church. So then there were Baptists in the book of Acts, and everything that deviated off of that was a deviation. So that's the secessionist theory of Baptist origin. We have the British or the English separatist view. What was the third one?
Is it the modern Protestant perspective?
They followed the Anabaptist.
Yeah, that they were influenced by Anabaptist activities. Remember, we talked about them specifically in Geneva, their origin, and we talked about how, remember, for a period of time, Anabaptist was not a good word. It almost got equated with terrorism because how it got wrapped up in some political things, particularly in the Netherlands, but elsewhere. So yeah, those are the three theories. As I think I tried to clearly express last week, I hold to all three of them as having some element of truth, but I don't hold to just one of them. I certainly don't hold to it's only the landmark successionist view, you know, the trail of blood we talked about concept there. We spent some time trying to decipher that chart with lots of red dots on it, if you remember it correctly. And there's no doubt that there's Anabaptist influence. We're going to see that today, I think, but we're also going to see how there's this English separatist influence. So I hold to sort of a blending of these three viewpoints as all having some air of validity. And I think that's the appropriate place to be. I did want to just talk briefly about why would it be important to tie back to the first century church, this secessionist thought. Why is that important?
Because that was the foundation of the church.
Right. Is there sort of an equivalence of that in Catholic tradition?
Yes, because they say that Peter's the first pope, basically. So it's going back all the way to the time of Jesus.
So the Catholic Church holds to this theory we talked about a number of times called Apostolic Succession, that, you know, it's the carrying through and they can trace that line back to Peter. So it's not surprising that those who were finding themselves in opposition to the Catholic Church, be they Protestants or even if they're claiming not to be, would claim what? We have that same succession that goes back. We're the originals. You're claiming you're the originals, we're claiming we're the originals. Do you see how that would be an important thing even early on for folks to claim?
Yeah.
And then becomes very important later. There's another thing that's going to start creeping in here, and we're going to come across it today, is there is a long-standing animosity in varying degrees and from various camps and circles between Baptists and Catholics. This is particularly true of those that are in the landmark Baptist tradition. So they fall more into that secessionist view of Baptist origins. But we're going to see it here even in the early advent of what we're going to be covering today, which is really more that English separatist tradition. We're going to see that there was animosity that existed between folks that we would identify as Baptists and the Catholic Church. There was animosity between the Protestant movement and the Catholic Church. It's not unique to Baptists, but it does exist. And so I think that, in my mind, is part of how I understand a lot of the 19th century rise of this what's called landmarkism in Baptist thought, which is very much carries a strain of anti-Catholic to it. And so we're not going to shy away from that. We'll end up talking about that as we move through it. Any questions from last week or anything else before we jump in here? All right, then let's get to it. I'm going to go back and just review this here briefly. So this is the chart we've been using. Again, it's simplified, but not as busy as others, but not as simple as it could be. And we're mainly focusing in this area here, which is what's happening on the lower half of the chart where Baptists are breaking off in the area of the Congregationalists. This is the influence in England. But remember that this exists, this connection between the Anglican Church and what was going on with Calvinistic and Reformed thought, which leads out to this. So don't let the chart fool you into thinking that things just broke very easily. 1517 Luther, 1525 the break off of Anabaptists and the Mennonites, 1536 Calvin's Institutes of Religion. It's not as clean and clear and crisp as what we see here. Going back a little bit, we need to remind ourselves a little bit about the timeline of the English monarchy, because we're going to interface with this again today. Remember that the Anglican movement, the English Reformation started under which English king? Under Henry. 1534, the Act of Supremacy. And remember what the Act of Supremacy declared that he was the supreme head of the church in England. As we talked about before, that was mainly because he had the problem of how was he going to get rid of his wife Catherine, how was he going to get a divorce when the Pope wouldn't grant it. And then we talked about how things progressed along, including his son Edward. Then we got down to Mary and Elizabeth. We've talked about the back and forth that happened between Catholics and Protestants here. Then we talked about eventually Elizabeth dies with no heir. And so James, who is James VI of Scotland, is invited because he has the claim to the throne to be James I of England, which unites England and Scotland. This is the James of King James Bible fame. This is the James of Jamestown being named for. And James rules from 1603 to 1625 during the early part of the 17th century. We're going to cover this period a lot today, so just reminding this. And then James is succeeded by his son Charles I. And so I remember doing for tests in high school, I remember it was James, Charles, James was the line of monarchs, because you do have this period here that's in green on this chart when Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads, when there's a period of time in England when there is no king, when they throw off a king and then Charles comes back to restore the monarchy in 1660. So the English Civil War begins in 1642. Charles is executed in 1649. So from 1649 to 1650 to 1660, there is no king in England. Remember, who was the head of the church in England? The king. So during this period of time, you did not have that same formal understanding about who was the head of the church. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit. And then we'll get down, probably not today, but into next week, talking about Charles II, James II, and then William and Mary, and then eventually Queen Anne. But just putting the context again, James is a Protestant or a Catholic?
Protestant.
He's a Protestant. Comes from Scotland, which means he was heavily influenced by Calvinist thought, which had taken hold in Scotland. Presbyterians come out of Scottish Calvinism. So he's a Protestant, very much holding more towards a Calvinistic view of Protestantism, but he is definitely a Protestant. And if you recall, one of the first things that he does early on is tap out and tap down some of the Catholic elements that were still there that were looking to bring back Catholic rulers. Any questions about that quick review back of English history? We don't need to dwell on it long, but I wanted to reset the stage because this is what's going to be going on as a backdrop to what we're going to be talking about today. All right. So, who were the first Baptists? This is the slide from the video that we looked at last week. We talked about that there were two broad camps of early Baptists. Now, the Baptists that I'm talking about here are the Baptists that are in the English separatist tradition of Baptists. And so there are the general Baptists and the particular Baptists. And the general and particular labels come from their view on one of the 5 points of Calvinism that we talked about. It's the L in the TULIP acronym, the question of limited atonement. Anybody remember what limited atonement argues for inside of Calvinism?
Only atone for those that are elect.
Right. The concept is that there's only a certain portion that are elect. We're all totally depraved. And so Christ died for salvation, but only for those to which salvation has been granted by God through his election. So that's a limited view of the atonement. That's where the L comes from in the TULIP. Arminianism challenged back against that, saying that the atonement was for what? Was for all. It's general. And so the difference between general Baptists and particular Baptists are over this point, where they stand on that element of the Calvinist Arminianist spectrum, the debate. General Baptists, more influenced by Jacob Arminius, meaning that the atonement was general. Particular Baptists being focused more along the Calvin lines, saying that there was predestination and thus the atonement was limited. Any questions about that? I don't want to go back over that because we spent so much time on it, but I don't want to miss it before it starts popping up here for us. Okay. In the early 17th century in England, there are both of these flavors of Baptist, and that will continue along for another couple of hundred years, even moving over to the New World. As we continue to go through Baptist history, particularly in North America, we'll see that there still are these sort of two broad camps that exist moving forward. So putting that context back in place, here's a picture of James I. He was King of England and Ireland. He was also still the King of Scotland. James was not necessarily very open-minded when it came to the idea of religious liberty. And the concept basically came from this, is that if you were willing to challenge the authority of the religious authorities, whose other authority might you be willing to very easily want to challenge?
The kings.
His. And since he derived his authority from being God's appointed representative, the divine right of kings concept, he was not necessarily a very tolerant person at all when it came to religious liberty. Now, remembering back when we talked about the Anabaptist influence, what was one of the key things we talked about with the Anabaptist, other than believing in believers' baptism versus infant baptism? What was another mark of the Baptists that were there in Switzerland?
Was it
government out?
Very much separation of church and state. That there was not a role for the state to make decisions and determinations about religious practice and the way that it was being done. And so this is a tension that gets built in here that we're going to see as we cover this particular stretch of Baptist history today. Any questions about that? Yeah, these are the dates of his life, 1566 to 1625. He took the throne in 1603. And in 1607, 8, 9, sort of in this period of time here, we actually come across this guy by the name of John Smith with a Y. And he is one of the first recognized what we would sort of refer to as modern Baptists, looking at the separatist view of this. So as you can see, he was ordained as an Anglican priest, so he's in England, but he broke from the Church of England and he moved to Holland, and this is in the 1607-ish, 1608 time frame. So who is king when Smith is breaks from the Church of England and moves to Holland? James. And part of the reason that Smith leaves England to go to Holland is Holland was much more open and free towards the idea of other thoughts inside of Protestantism. This is James now in control, and it's not easy to be a dissenter or a separatist. At various forms, there's various forms of persecution. Smith actually ends up in 1609 in Holland, and he comes through reading of scripture to definitely believe in the concept of believer's baptism, credo baptism versus patio baptism versus infant baptism. So he has a small group of followers that have come with him from England and that he's gathered in Holland. And in 1609, they are really believing that, like some of the Anabaptists did in 1525, just to put it in context, back in Geneva, that baptism should be only for believers. Now, they have all, for the most part, already been baptized as infants inside of the Anglican Church or inside of other places. And so this sort of leads them to a dilemma. They believe in believers' baptism. They believe this is an important part of who they are. But the question is, who's going to baptize them? And so again, the congregation moved to Amsterdam. They lived above a bakery that were owned by some Mennonites. Mennonites are a break off of the Anabaptists from Minnow Simons. And as they come to believe that they need to follow a more New Testament model of baptism, the question is, how are they going to be baptized? And so an interesting thing happens. They believed that somebody needed to be baptized to baptize others. So in 1609, John Smith, when he adopts believer's baptism, baptizes himself. Do you remember the kid from the video last week that got so excited and dunked himself? And he made the reference, the newborn made the reference to, maybe he was like doing a John Smith here. John Smith actually baptized himself. Now, he didn't do that by dunking himself. It was by effusion, by pouring water over himself. But he baptized himself, and then he baptized one of his followers, a guy named Hellas. We'll look at him a lot, and then about 40 others that were part of their congregation. A couple of weeks later, he starts wondering, was that actually the right thing to do? And so there's this congregation of Waterlander Mennonites who are Anabaptists, who believe in believers' baptism. And so he decides that he wants to join their fellowship and join them by baptism to get, if you will, properly baptism. He began to question his own self-baptism and whether or not the congregation was okay because he self-baptized and then baptized them. And so he writes this thing called the Short Confession, and he seeks to join with the Mennonite fellowship that's there. Sort of his story from 1609 to 1612 is a little bit of a sad one, in the sense that he doesn't really fit in with the Mennonites. He has trouble with his own congregation because of this going back and forth. We're going to see Hellas here in a second. And he ends up dying in 1612, shortly after this, without any affiliation with any congregation anywhere. But his congregation is considered by most scholars to be the first Baptist church in modern time. Short-lived.
Baptist church to follow.
Yeah, short-lived and problematic, but it is the first Baptist church that's sort of recognized. This is the church in 1609, which flows out of that 1607 to 1609 time frame. Some of the dates get a little bit fuzzy here. Any questions about Smith's story?
Yes. Okay, Don,
Yeah.
you make it sound so easy that he graduates from Cambridge and denounces the Church of England, and hey, he just moves over to Holland. There's a couple of problems with that. Language, and of course, being able to obtain a job. what is, it seemed like that they're moving back and forth. Is there colonies in Holland that speak English, or you understand what I'm saying? I don't understand unless you're a well-educated person knows several different languages.
There were a lot of English that had fled to Holland because of religious persecution. So that wasn't uncommon. In fact, some of the settlers that we know that come to what we know as America actually leave from Holland more so than they leave from England, because they had already fled to there and then they were fleeing over. But you're right. You had to have money to do that. Language was an issue. He was, supported by the congregation, but what was the congregation doing? You're right. It's not just a piece of cake during this age. It's not a piece of cake just to leave one country today and go to another country at all. It certainly wasn't the case back then, even when all you were doing was really crossing the English Channel. That still required, as you said, resources. You had language issues, you had cultural issues, all the things that went with that.
Did they have passports, or did they have some sort of requirement? Looks
No,
like you had taxation and that's all sorts of complications.
yeah, not quite the same way we do today. Immigration sort of worked a little bit differently there. I mean, that didn't mean that you could just go anywhere you want to and be welcome, because you could just as easily be unwelcome there or kicked out or expelled. But it wasn't the case of, having passports or having your quote unquote citizenship, recognized the way that we think of modern, the way that we think of this in a modern context really doesn't quite apply the same way. But your culture would have made it difficult in some places to find work, to find resources, that type of thing. All of that would have still existed.
Well, when it said he lived over a bakery or the church met over a bakery.
It's a little bit tough for me to figure that out from everything I read and listened or watched too. It sort of seems like it was both, because the church was more or less meeting in his home. And apparently he lived over the bakery that was Mennonite bakery, and so that was the connection here.
It's gonna sound pretty funny, I guess, but a Mennonite bakery, do Mennonites have special dietary needs, kind of like a Jewish bakery? I think of, lots of bakeries cater to them because of the type of breads and the leavenings and the stuff like that.
Not that I'm aware of.
I don't know anything about Mennonites, so.
It could have just as easily, if time had been different, living over a Mennonite car garage, if it had been, if that had been the time there. But definitely there was this back and forth interconnection between these Waterlander Mennonites. And again, just going back here, let me go back to the Mennonites were a 1537 offshoot in the Anabaptist movement. So these are long-standing Anabaptists that are in the Netherlands. But there was a lot of interaction that went back and forth between this group of Waterlander Mennonites, Waterlander meaning the territory there in where they were in the Netherlands. Most of the Netherlands had to be reclaimed from the ocean because of dikes, that kind of thing. That's where that comes from. And then also the baptism by the believer's baptism by immersion. There was a back and forth between the two. Now Helwys is important here because Helwys is part of Smith's group, and Helwys is a person of, back to Nikki's question, Helwys is a person of some means. He has some money. And so it seems to be the case from everything I read and what's intimated there, that he was a lot of what enabled them financially to move over and be over there. He helped fund the group when he came over with them from England. And so he's a member of the congregation, but he's a notable member of the congregation because he's helping to fund some of what's going on with the congregation. So Smith and Helwys are connected here, 1607, 1608, 1609. So here's Helwys. He financed the trip to Amsterdam. He came, but his wife and children stayed in England. And so an interesting thing there, not clear to me from anything that I read whether his wife and children stayed for financial reasons, for religious reasons. I mean, all of that to me is sort of a little bit unclear. But definitely what happens is, while Helwys has been one of Smith's congregants and been part of his congregation, he disagreed with Smith over the decision to become a Mennonite. And as a result, that this was the First Baptist Church, right? That we have in modern history. So what did the First Baptist Church do almost immediately?
Split.
Wasn't over the color of the carpet, over something else. This was over the fact that Smith had this sort of crisis of conscience about whether or not his self-baptism was sufficient, and he wanted to become a Mennonite to make sure that his baptism was good. But as a result, Helwys becomes the pastor of those that remain that didn't go with Smith over to the Mennonites. So this first church does this. Now, this group apparently comes back to England about this time of the split. And so not only does the split happen in that group of believers between Smith and Helwys, but Helwys and the group that he's pastoring comes back to England. And so now we have, they were Englishmen that had gone over to the Netherlands. Now we have them coming back. They're worshiping in English. Everything they're doing is in English. And in 1611, Helwys writes the Declaration of Faith of English People. This is one of the first, if you will, Baptist separatist document that's written. It's the first Baptist confession of faith that's written in English. That's in 1611. Everything I was able to follow there, this is now him. It seems to be moving back and forth between the Netherlands and England, but he's definitely back in England during parts of this. So the split, again, is over self-baptism. It's over some other things. Helwys was a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that Smith theologically was aligning more with the Mennonites now. The Mennonites had a slightly different view of Christology, meaning the relationship of Christ in terms of the Trinity, slightly different than what Helwys was comfortable with, and he was suspicious of it. He definitely returns to England in 1611, and they differ in positions on original sin, justification, and the magistracy, meaning the role of offices inside of the church. So this is them actually, with as best I'm able to tell here, Smith being a little bit more Calvinist in his viewpoint, and Helwys being a little bit more of a general Baptist in his viewpoint in terms of how they viewed the Calvin Arminian split here. And ultimately, this spearheaded the General Baptist movement. And then in 1612, Helwys, who was had the means to do so, so he was penned a short declaration called the Mystery of Iniquity. And what's interesting about this is this was also a statement now about religious liberty in England. Remember, this is in the period of time when James, trying to hold things together, trying to keep uniformity throughout the church. And so Helwys writes this thing that's pretty critical of the Crown's position on that. And by the way, sends essentially an autographed copy to King James. So there's a little bit of boldness in Helwys. Not only is he writing about this, it's like, oh, by the way, writing against you, here you go. So I think he'd have been an interesting character to meet. I get the sense that he was a little bit of a firebrand in a lot of different ways, just because of what we see in his life, particularly during this particular time. So in his declaration of faith, Helwys, here's a couple of the key points: believer's baptism and closed communion. So what are the two ordinances that we hold to as Baptists? Baptism, Lord's Supper. So when we talk about a closed communion, what does that mean?
And only the members are the ones who are participating.
Correct. And we have Baptist churches today that hold to a position of closed communion, that only members are allowed to partake of the Lord's Supper. Then you have what's commonly referred to as an open communion position, which is that any believer can take communion. Helwys held a position of that this is something that is an ordinance for the local body of believers close to them. falling back over on the Arminian side of the Calvinist-Arminius debate, he does articulate that we have free will that's aided by God's grace. So more of an Arminius position regarding salvation and how grace works. We have a choice in our salvation, and that's general atonement. But then he also holds, remember, this is the unique thing we've talked about before, sort of the blender thing that we have happen with Baptist theology. If you hold to the idea that you have freedom to choose, what does that mean? You have the risk of losing your salvation, right? That's one of the trade-offs. So he did also articulate that there's the ability to fall from grace. So Hellas would not be a once saved, always saved, perseverance of the saints kind of guy. Believed in free will. Free will came with the choice, but also came with the potential to lose your salvation. And again, thus he would fall in the category of being in this division of general versus particular Baptist, a general Baptist on the question of atonement. Any questions about those points? Furthermore, churches established by the confession of faith and baptism, not by a covenant. Baptists are not people of covenants and creeds. This is a declaration. This is not a creedal statement. The church is autonomous, this idea of local church autonomy, but also the church is autonomous from the government. So autonomous here means both local autonomy as well as broader autonomy, separate politically. Church members can do the ordinances without a pastor. There is no need for a hierarchical clergy for the ordinances to be recognized. You don't need a priest to have communion, the Eucharist.
Don't make it churches.
Yeah, and the church is also not to get too big, because their viewpoint here was what had happened with the church pre-Reformation.
Got too big for its britches.
Yeah, and everybody was a member. No, the only way you become a member of the church is through belief and through baptism. So that the church was, and then also that a lot of this has to do with a lot of the reading of the New Testament in terms of, narrow is the gate. Even some ideas, he had some interesting ideas on Revelation we're going to see here in a minute. But this idea that the church by definition is a smaller group of believers. Questions about any of those?
How did they define too big?
What, Doug?
What was too big?
I don't know. I stole these slides, obviously, Fred. This is actually stolen from that same thing. I grabbed them as slides instead of us watching the video. But I got the sense from things that I read that think of the size of that each individual church, and the church here, not the big church, not the big C church, but this is more the congregation, that a congregation should be of a reasonable size, probably not exceeding that 40 to 50 like they had when Smith first took the group over to the Netherlands. If you got much bigger than that, what was going to happen when you got much bigger than that? You were going to develop hierarchies, right? Because you'd almost have to. And so a little bit was, if you keep the church the right size, it can self-manage itself as a congregation. If it gets big, suddenly you have to create these offices and roles that were not intended. But belief in congregational rule and authority extending only to that congregation. No congregation can tell another congregation what to do. Again, very much holding to those things that are there. The election of elders and deacons, interesting in his declaration, both men and women could hold those offices. And also participation in government and oaths was not forbidden. In other words, we are separate from the government, but it doesn't mean you can't be part of the government or take an oath to the government. It's just that your position as a believer needs to be superior to the oath that you would take to the king or to the government.
Don?
Yeah.
How far did they go with this concept of women or he? Because if you're elder or deacon, you can also perform other rites, can you not? That a pastor will be able to do communion and that sort of thing. Is that correct?
Well, remember though that he said that church members can do the ordinances without a pastor. So you
Correct.
didn't need an elder or a deacon, for example, to have the Lord's Supper or to have communion. So I tried to look around for this exactly, and I'm going to dig into it a little bit more. For example, would he have advocated that it was okay for a woman to conduct a baptism? I don't know the answer to that question.
I noticed recently the Catholic Church is opening up the door to lay women and men.
Right. And so in general, here are some of the characteristics of English separatism, and you see them these early Baptist thought and theology woven in with there. Primacy of the Bible, scripture, of course, insistence on a regenerate church, meaning that you have made a decision for salvation. It's not something that happens as a result of infant baptism or something that your parents would choose for you. The rejection of a hierarchical church authority. There's some congregational elements, but some Presbyterian elements, but still this idea that the local congregation, or there's more autonomy that's locally centered versus being more largely centered, and then simple and spontaneous styles of worship. These are characteristics not just of Baptists as separatists, but generally what was going on inside the separatist movement in England. Essentially, it was anti-Anglican in the sense of what they thought of the Anglican Church as being too Catholic. It's the rejection of the Anglo-Catholic element of the Anglican Church, if that makes any sense. Questions about any of that? So on this idea of church and state, here's what John Smith actually put down, some of the things that he wrote in writing. This is the intersection of church and state. I like the image here that they had on the slide that I stole. Is that magistrates don't have the right to compel women or women to a specific form of religion. In other words, the church cannot tell you at any level of authority, from the king down to the lowest magistrate, what to do when it comes to religion, doctrine of the church.
It says John Smith's response. So he's responding to what
he's responding
is writing.
He's responded somewhat to Helwas, but he's also responding to just what's going on with James. And so Smith stated and believed Christ is the only king and lawgiver of the church and of conscience. So it ain't James, it's Jesus. And that government is limited to civil transgression. Government's role is civil, it is not religious. And so, these are an extension of what we'd already seen with the Anabaptists and already seen here as well. It's this idea that we have today of the separation of church and state. That is very much in our Baptist heritage. I'm very proud of that being in our Baptist heritage and how that plays out, in the United States and elsewhere. This very much flows out of early Baptist thought, tying back again to that Anabaptist influence of the separation between church and state. Comments, questions about that? I'm going to ask a question here. How unusual is that today? I mean, it's the way that we think of things here in the US, but globally, how much do you think that there is a separation between church and state globally?
In just about all of Christendom, it's pretty common. I would say wouldn't you think it's the
Roman
dominant?
Catholic Church is pretty.
Well, but even in the Catholic countries, there's not intertwining of church and state, mainly because the church has become so weak.
And corrupt.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
I think in the last century to century and a half, it has become more the norm across all of Christendom. It probably is less, there still is a heavy role between church and state. For example, in England, the Anglican Church is still officially the Church of England.
And Queen Elizabeth is the head of the Anglican Church.
That's why so much of the controversy around Charles and his divorce and could he ever be king because of that. So that still exists, but it exists more, I'm going to say it exists more on paper and in formality than it actually exists in. It exists more in formality than it exists in reality. Does that make any sense if I draw that line? It's formally that's the case, but practically no one is being forced in England to be a member of the Church of England. That doesn't exist now, like it definitely did during the period of time that we're going to be looking at here.
If you look at other countries that you are forced to be believing in a certain denomination, or you're pretty much killed or cut out.
That certainly exists, and I think it was important that Doug made the distinction that he did about Christendom. When we start talking about broadly about religious liberty and the state, that certainly does not exist in fundamentalist Islamic countries.
Well, in China.
In China, there is no church.
Right, but if you're a member of a Christian congregation, you may be
excluded from all types of things.
Right.
And so it's amazing to me that we are now 4 centuries removed from this plus, and this debate and this struggle continues. It's in a different form. It's slightly different for us than it would have been 200 years ago or 300 years ago, but it still exists. This question of the role of church and state and the interaction between the two is still something that's rolling around out there. And it's a very important part of the early theology of Baptists that there be a separation. And of course, we happen to be blessed in this country where there's a formal separation of that, and that's been maintained now, since our Bill of Rights, since the Constitution. Helwys is a little bit interesting in some of the things that we're going to find here. This is also early on. He connected the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Church with his interpretation of eschatology. And so he very much believed that in Revelation 13, there's 2 beasts. The first beast was the Roman Catholic Church, and the second beast was the Anglican Church.
Interesting.
And so what was his take on both of those? If you're associating those with the beasts of Revelation, what do you think he thinks about them?
They're evil.
Yeah.
Not highly, that they're evil. And so his interpretation, part of his eschatological interpretation was that they were living out in his time some of the things that were being represented in Revelation. Without chasing the eschatology rabbit that just ran across the trail here too far, I think it is always amazing to me, and there's an element of truth in this, is that everybody thinks they're dealing with Revelation right now. And that's true going back to the 1st century, and it's true all the way down to today. There seems to be that constant theme. The way that it plays itself out or gets understood is different, but it tends to be very consistent. It's always the end times. And thus he believed that Catholics and Anglicans were ungodly. And he also was not big fans of the Puritans. Remember, the Puritans were the ones that were wanting to essentially to just further reform the Anglican Church. And so he didn't believe that they were separate enough, and that most separatists were not godly enough because they had only partially separated from the church. He wanted full separation here. So this is Helwys being a lot more of a firebrand, and he's even bringing his view of end times and eschatology into the current thing that's happening there in England. And again, remember that part of the reason you would think that is this was true of the 1st century church, true of the church throughout history, is one of the elements of Revelation is what's going on with believers, what's happening to them.
Being persecuted.
Persecution. And so when you're in periods of persecution and times of persecution, it's much easier to read yourself into what you're reading there than at other times. And so they're definitely under persecution. So he sees them as having been persecuted by the Catholic Church and being persecuted by the Anglican Church. So that's part of what causes him to have this connection. He was well ahead of his time with regards to religious liberty, even for non-Baptists. This is a quote from him. be they Turks, Jews, or whatever, it's not for any earthly power to punish them. And so his stance on religious liberty was sort of so radical in his day that it probably cost him support even in his own day. He had pushed to a place that a lot of people probably weren't willing to go yet because they were culturally and historically tied to the idea of
Heretics.
hierarchical.
Yeah. It's like heretics.
Yeah,
No, it's not the right, it's not the way we spell heretics today. It's the older version of
The old
heretics.
way, yeah. And Jews, we don't add the second E, and Turks don't get a C today. All right. So again, I talked in 1612, he published this short declaration of iniquity. There you see the like the cover page from that, which didn't have a picture of him in it. But he states that an earthly sword ordained of God only for an earthly power, and a spiritual sword for a spiritual power. The king rules in things temporal, the church rules in things spiritual. And he sent an autographed copy to the king. The king, who was very much into maintaining control. So I'm sure that went over well. The answer, of course, is no. And so what happens, I'll go back and pick that up in a second. So what happens is this begins a period of time where Baptists are, particularly Helwys and some of the more vocal and advocating Baptists, are sort of in conflict with both the crown and with the Anglican Church. And so there's going to be a period here of actual persecution and perceived persecution.
Yeah, he would have endorsed that wholeheartedly.
And again, if you're associating the Anglican Church with a beast of revelation, you can guess how that's sort of coming across. Any questions about? Go ahead.
We were just saying that, or I was just saying that Helwys's interpretation would have fit directly into the trail of blood. He would have.
Yeah, I think he was an early landmarkist in that sense.
Yes.
And some of his stuff is what's drawn on later by the landmark movement. When they're looking for somebody to quote, from a couple of centuries back, you probably could easily find something in Helwys to quote from, right?
Yeah.
So out of that, now remember that he was more of a General Baptist or a particular Baptist?
Or of a General Baptist.
He was more of a General Baptist.
Particular Baptist.
Yeah, but there also are those who are in the mold of the particular Baptist that are growing at this time. And so the particular Baptists also emerge out of English separatism. And the way you sometimes see this described is in 1616, it's what they call the JLJ church, not to be confused with the LDS church or something else. The JLJ comes from the last name of the three first pastors or prominent pastors, Henry Jacob, John Lathrop, and Henry Jesse, so JLJ. And they were separatists in the sense, but they came out of a slightly different, they didn't come directly falling out of the Helwys tradition or the Smith-Helwys group there. They were sort of functioning separately, but they came along to, again, experiencing the controversy with the Anglican Church over baptism. And so they are Anglicans that come to believe in believers' baptism and thus believe that there's a need for separation from the church over the question of baptism. And the church was not willing to grant that. The Anglican Church is still practicing infant baptism. And so as that church gets formed in 1616, eventually the controversy rises even more. There's an example here of one of the early leaders leaving the church left because a member had his child baptized in the state church. There were still some that were sort of going back and forth. Yeah, I'm having my kid baptized so that we don't get ostracized from society, but then I also believe in believers' baptism. And there were others like 1633, Samuel Eaton here believed starting a new church to establish baptism. So believers' baptism, hence Baptist, is very, very, very important for both the General Baptists and the Particular Baptists early on, again, in the mode of English separatism. By 1638, a group had left that had joined with Eaton, a guy by the name of Spilsbury, who's a very important person in the early Baptist movement in terms of an early pastor. They formed their own churches. They actually start becoming recognized as Particular Baptists by the 1630s. And they all eventually, in some flavor or fashion, again, struggling with this idea of how do we get baptized, having Dutch Anabaptists sort of stepping in to give their baptisms to them, we end up forming these churches that are separate from the Hellas movement, that were General Baptist churches, but that were Particular Baptist churches. So that by the 1630s and 1640s, there were actually more Particular Baptist churches than there were General Baptist churches represented throughout the area of London.
Oh.
So when we ask the question, are Baptists Calvinists or Arminians, the answer is yes.
Yes.
We have a tradition that goes back both ways. And as I mentioned earlier, we like to borrow from both sides of that, of that chart. Like that free will thing, also like that perseverance of the saints thing. Want my atonement to be general, Christ died for all, but once I'm saved, I always want it. Borrowing from both. It's a blending of the two concepts. And Anabaptism and Arminian thought, remember, Arminian thought really came out of the Netherlands. So this interaction that's going on between Baptists in England and the Netherlands, that ties all of that together as well. Now, eventually, James is no longer king in 1625, and his son Charles takes over. My general take on everything I've ever heard or read about Charles is an idiot. And really is not well suited to be a monarch. Definitely believes in the divine right of kings, which means his divine right. Not as politically savvy as his father was. And it's actually during Charles's reign, beginning in the late 1620s until the end of his reign in 1649, that you have some of the most violent persecutions that happen against nonconformists. So his father had taken action against nonconformists and separatists, but not quite to the level that Charles did. And in fact, Charles sort of upped the ante. He called himself the supreme governor of the church. Even a step than James, he believed that he was second only to God/Christ when it came to determining what religious practice should be in England. So this ups the bar in terms of what's happening in terms of persecutions that existed under James's reign. They grow more intense under Charles's reign. So much so that people lost their goods. There were actual beatings and whippings. It was certainly common for folks to be imprisoned because they weren't willing to adhere to a public confession of Anglican thought. You literally had people that were maimed in other ways. Others were executed, and Baptists were actually in prison, and thus, as a result of that, were executed or died in prison. This would very much also tie into that trail of blood concept of martyrdom inside of the Baptist movement. This is not by the Catholic Church. This is by whom? The Anglicans, other Protestants, other quote unquote Protestants, because they were not willing to conform. Again, this plays very much well into that concept of why someone like, Hellas and some of his followers would say, what? They're the beasts of Revelation.
And this was under, would you say, King Charles the First?
Under James, and then transitioning to Charles starting in 1625.
Were there Catholic churches in England as well that got persecuted by the?
Yeah, and there were other separatists as well, not unique to Baptists. But Baptists, beginning with Hellas sending his autographed copy of his book to the king, were some of the most outspoken about this. And plus, they were also the ones that weren't just saying, we differ in religious practice, but what were they also saying? You don't have the right to tell us how to practice. So it was there was an extra, instead of they're not just saying we disagree, not only do we disagree, you don't even have the right to tell me what to do. So it had both a political and a religious bend to it. So people are dying. What tends to happen when people are dying for their faith?
The faith spreads.
The faith
Yeah.
spreads, and that was happening. And the other thing is people sometimes want to say, let's be clear on what we're dying for, right?
Yeah.
Let's don't
Yeah.
leave, let's don't let this be ambiguous. And so as a result of that, in 1644, we have the First London Confession. So this is really one of the primary Baptist written documents that seeks to codify what Baptists believe. And so it's the churches throughout the London area that gather together and they publish this confession of faith. This is what we believe. Notice here on the cover page, 1644. Notice there's 3 scripture references right on the front. One going back to Acts, that idea of tying back to the early church, and then other things as well. So if you're going to die for your faith, it's not an uncommon thing to make sure you fully clarify what it is you are dying for. And we find that here. Notice here the which are commonly called, notice this is a Baptist confession of faith, but notice the term here. Anabaptist. They were still thought of and often associated with the Anabaptist movement.
But what does it say, which are commonly, though,
Falsely called Anabaptist. So the other reason for publishing this, in addition to the fact that people are dying for these beliefs, is to say what?
we're not Anabaptists?
We're not Anabaptists. We're something different. Don't get confused.
What's that second scripture reference?
It's in Isaiah 8, I think it's 8:30. So 1644, this is an important moment in Baptist doctrinal life in the sense of the first time that we have first time we really have a modern Baptist written confession. We'd had what Helwis had published, a little bit of what Smith
Yeah,
had
this
written.
thing isn't as short as what that little picture shows on the screen.
I'm
I'm
sorry?
looking at it, it's like really long.
What's really long?
That's just
The actual
that's just the
document,
title
I'm
thing.
like, oh my God, I'm looking at the actual document, it's like very lengthy.
Yeah, here, this is just the title page.
I see that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not just modern time would be just this stuff at the top, right? And again, they wanted to very early on the title page, this is based in scripture. In fact, you see by the touchstone of the word of truth. Again, one of the concepts is there. So that's 1644. This is as we're moving towards the height of the persecution under Charles I. So the First Learning Confession, it's 7 particular Baptist congregations that gather together to do this. So this flows out of the particular Baptist side of the Baptist, the general particular Baptist. 4 of those congregations were descendants of that JLJ church. It refuted the accusations that particular Baptists were radical Anabaptists like those that had been in Munster. That's where they had some of that Anabaptist, really radical stuff that caused that word to be associated with terrorism. And that they, again, radical Anabaptists believe the Reformation would improve theology as well as social and political relationships. The radical Anabaptists were very political. This group of particular Baptists, that separation of church and state, were not political. That's part of the reason they wanted to clearly say, we're not like those. First of all, don't call us Anabaptists. We're not Anabaptists, and we're not like them because we intentionally don't want to influence quite the same way or have ourselves tied to the government or to the state. So the First London Confession primarily flows out of the particular Baptist side of the movement, which was the larger side of the movement at this time. And again, it covers things like particular atonement. So there it is, covering the limited atonement view, perseverance of the saints, very Calvinistic in a lot of its theology. Faith is a gift of God, but they don't quite pronounce human depravity quite like they did at the Council of Dort. So there's a little bit of that in between the two positions. No mention of covenant theology. Notice though, even though they are Calvinist, the gospel should be preached to all. It's that idea of we don't know who God has elected, so we need to preach to everyone. And a strong view of Christ in the Trinity. So any of those questions about some of the shakiness perhaps of Christology inside of like the Mennonites and things like that, that Helwys had objected to with Smith. They make it very clear here. We believe that Jesus is God. He's an equal part of the Trinity. The church is composed of visible saints. If you're a believer, you know you're a believer. Baptism by immersion. This is the first official statement of believers' baptism by immersion. Don't pour water over your head. This is what's there. Congregational polity, the roles of pastor, teacher, elder, and deacon, and being very strongly in favor of the disestablishment of a state church. So the separation of church and state contained very much within that First London Confession. Do you see how many of these things very much pattern what we believe in terms of modern theology as Baptists?
Yes.
Now, except for the questions of Calvinism versus Arminianism, there's a lot of what represents modern Baptist thought that can be traced back to this First London Confession. From 1648 to 1660, Charles gets executed. The Cromwell takes over. This was a fantastic time compared to what it had been before for Baptists. There is religious liberty because there's no longer James and Charles. They took advantage of this. There's a very much evangelical Protestantism that's associated with this, the liberty and all of that. Baptists were finally able to publicly preach, to publicly form churches, to issue confessions without fear of reprisal, to distribute material. So this is like, it's called the Saints regime here. This is a glorious time for Baptists from the demise of Charles up until the return of Charles II. But very important time. This is going on during the reign of Oliver Cromwell, and it's something that they take advantage of. So they.
Who executes Charles? There's basically somebody.
Oh, he's executed by there'd been
By a
by-
group of people who are
by England. Yes, yes.
getting them out,
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah.
Was Cromwell the leader of that since Cromwell kind of took over?
He's one of the leaders of it. Yeah, the Roundheads. So this is
Who?
the Roundheads is what they're called.
Okay.
So this is the period right here. The Civil War had begun in 1642. They finally execute Charles in 1649. Cromwell takes over as the leader, as the head of Parliament. Parliament now asserting control compared to the crown. There is no king during this period of time. And by the way, they end up in war with Spain during this period of time, which is part of the reason they end up restoring the monarchy in 1660. We can come back around to that. Somebody has that as a question without going too far deep off into the politics here. So from this, go ahead.
So Oliver Cromwell is in Parliament?
He's the leader of Parliament. He's the leader.
Of Parliament.
Right.
So it's basically Parliament.
He's the prime minister. He's the de facto leader of the government when there now is no king. So he is the leader of the government.
But I mean, it was Parliament working together to have Charles executed.
The forces that end up controlling Parliament while Cromwell and the Roundheads control Parliament are the ones that have Charles killed.
Okay.
And again, anything I've ever read or seen or listened to about Charles is
Right. No,
he ain't the sharpest tool in the shed, and was stubborn in terms of his beliefs, so much so that that's what cost him his. And he did back and forth things. He went and married. I strongly recommend the Ryan Reeves videos on those that I've recommended before. He goes and marries a French princess, and then he claims that he wasn't going to. He just does some really stupid stuff, which gets him into trouble. And then because of his autocracy, there's what comes back against him. So that period of time is fairly brief because Charles II comes back, or Charles II is brought to become the king in 1660. He restores the monarchy. He attempted to introduce some religious freedom for both Catholics and Protestants in 1672 with his Royal Declaration allowing indulgence, but Parliament would have nothing of it. So this is now, and basically from 1660 on, things sort of revert back. We go back to a monarchy and revert back to where things are not good for any dissenters, or separatists, but that's particularly true of Baptists. And so after those years of peace, they started enduring persecution again in 1660. They're singled out because of their strong stance on religious liberty again. And in fact, they're sort of given the blame for a lot of these issues relating church and state in England. You guys were part of what caused this to happen when we got rid of the monarch. So they're blamed for that moving forward. They're sort of viewed as being instigators in what led to the period under Cromwell. When things, as often happens in societies all over the place, when things swing back and forth politically or religiously, they swing back and forth in big ways. We talked about, remember the Mary, when it swings back to Mary in history there and back over, it works both ways. What's the dog doing? She's dreaming. Okay. So as a result of that, one of the things that happened shortly after Charles's return is the Act of Uniformity in 1662. I don't think anything ever good has come out of anything that is entitled an Act of Uniformity. Would y'all probably agree with that? Doesn't exactly sound like it's freedom loving in any stretch or form, right? So what happened here was, again, now being issued by Charles, the church taking control again, the Anglican Church, all English ministers had to believe the same doctrines and conduct worship in the same liturgy. There had to be uniformity among ministers. Anything that was a public prayer, sacrament, or rite had to be consistent with the Church of England and the previously published Book of Common Prayer. Very clear what's allowed and what's not allowed. And you could not be a minister, deacon, or bishop unless you were ordained to an Episcopal or Church of England ordination. So who's in control of deciding who the clergy are under the Act of Uniformity? The Anglican Church, which owes its power to the crown. And so this is, again, flipping back in the direction that it reverses back the 10 to 11 years of a lot of freedom. We go back in the other direction in 1662. And as a result, there's what's called the Great Ejection. As a result of the Act of Uniformity, about 20% of the English clergy lost their positions. So if you had been ordained outside of that, put in a position otherwise, so that's Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Independents, and Baptists. Baptists were not unique in terms of what happened here. 2,500 ministers lost their positions. Now, an interesting thing happens. When this many people get ejected, guess what happens to those that are in dissent? It actually becomes a more respectable position. You're not alone in what's happening here. In fact, what you see over here is actually this document that was published from a number of famous or well-known ministers of the day. This is their farewell sermons as they're being kicked out. Somebody actually published a book of their sermons.
Don, what were some of the practical results of clergy being kicked out? I mean, were there special privileges given to clergy, tax breaks, that kind of thing that was taken away here? Because I can't imagine this would have diminished the authority of Baptist or separatist pastors at all among their congregations.
Yeah, but what would have been different is their means of support. There would have been some economic impact. I'm not sure about the taxation question, but I'm sure they had some special exemptions because the church had carved those out against the crown in a lot of ways. Although the crown, remember under Henry, the crown had taken over church properties. I mean, that was one of the other big things that Henry was doing with the Act of Supremacy back in 1534. So I think there was some of that. I can't answer it in a lot of detail because I just don't know. But I do know that it had economic impact on them because now they were going to have to be supported exclusively by their congregations because they were no longer in the formal clerical structure that it allowed to exist under Cromwell, where you could be a separatist and, separatists weren't as separate, if that makes any sense, during that period of time under the Roundheads. That was more mainstream. And when it goes back in the other direction here. I just find it amazing that they published this thing of sermons, these like last sermons.
On those bottom two, are those skulls?
Yeah, I think they had passed away. That's why they have
Oh.
skulls there.
Okay. I was like,
Their funeral sermons. I hadn't noticed that before, but I remember reading something about that. So again, this is James II. He reigned from 1685 to 1688. He had more Catholic leanings. And so he actually, sometimes it's called the last Roman Catholic monarch of England. He allowed, it's not that the England became Catholic again, but that was his personal leaning. And as a result, it was fairly short-lived for him to be the king. The Glorious Revolution happens in 1688. He tries to flee the country. He gets caught. They let him and his wife and his son leave the country. And this is when William and Mary are invited in to be the king and queen of England in 1688, because they are from, ironically, this is William of Orange. He's actually from the Netherlands, descended indirectly from, has a claim to the throne through the houses of Tudor, House of Stuart, but they are invited back to take over the monarchy so that there's a Protestant king and queen. And by the way, this was done with the help of the Dutch fleet. So he becomes, ironically called King Billy. He and Mary reigned. They had been the rulers of Holland, coming to accept the English throne. They came from a Protestant family. Mary was actually the daughter of King James II. That's the right to the throne. And in 1689, the Act of Toleration is passed. And we'll pick back up on this next week, but this is just like there had been the Act of Uniformity in 1662 that created a lot of difficulty. The Act of Toleration in 1689 is a very important move back in the other direction. That's where we will pick things back up next week, since we're out of time today, to see what happens as a result of William and Mary taking the throne and Parliament passing acts that now enabled the toleration of the separatist movement. Questions, comments? There's my alarm right there telling me to stop. So I hear voices in the room. Who all's in the room there with you, Bill?
Second.
I heard Lori. I heard Doug.
Mickey.
There's Lorinda and Lori and Mickey. All right. Cool. The audio was much better today from the room there, guys. Whatever you did different or whatever worked a whole lot better. Maybe sticking Doug in front of the mic helped. I don't know.
Well, there's mic settings in Zoom that you can adjust to pick up more volume.
It was much, much better today than what we had in the past. So whatever you did worked. All right. If there are any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.